Okay.
Hi, we are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicinda. I'm Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire is to help amazing designers find great players who love their game and help amazing players find great designers whose games they can love. We do that in a lot of different ways, actual plays, reviews, but also one of the things that came up early on is that there are a lot of creators I just wanted to sit down and talk to who that was what they wanted to do also, was to sit down and talk, or people I just hound like today's guest until they actually say yes. And so today we're going to be sitting down with Jeeyon Shim to talk about connected path games and also just their entry into the design world, their background, and her amazing ability, I think, to create games that evoke an experience in a way that few other designers can do. I feel mildly intimidated. Very rarely on stream do I, because I feel like I've got to do a better job than I normally do, which is just one of those feelings. I always try to do a good job, so it doesn't matter. Now I'm rambling. Hey, thanks for Michael King says can't watch live, but look for it later. Looks like Brandon is watching Gil RPG's Wolf Wizard. I recently respect for a week to try out a new class. I am this week a cleric of Brandon Leon Gambetta all week long, just to see how that goes, see what it feels like. But with that said, Jeeyon, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online.
Hi. Well, thank you for that glowing intro. My name is Jeeyon Shim. I am an outdoor educator turned game designer. The tagline I put on a lot of my web copy is "I write games that face the world." You can find me on Twitter at Jeeyon Shim, and I have a pretty active Patreon at Jeeyon Shim as well. And I also have a lot of a la carte games up for sale on my itch.io store, which is where you can find a recent collaborative game I made with Shingen Core called Field Guide to Memory. Many of my independent projects that I've made on Kickstarter will end up there as well. And I think that's where you can find me.
Awesome. And it's all such good stuff. It is all super gorgeous. One of the places I love to just start with people is, how did you started playing games? Like, designing games eventually comes, but like,
Oh,
what was your entry into play?
I mean, if you're talking about just the basic like play of make believe, like we all do that as kids, but if you're talking specifically about tabletop, I think my first ever tabletop game was this weird modified version of Dread by Epidiah Ravishal. And the person running it really went all out. They had these manila folders with like expose files in them and classified like redacted text with blacked out stuff, and it was very cool. And I was like, this is awesome. I want to do this all the time. And then like 10 years passed and I didn't touch another tabletop game until I met my friend Inga, and she was running an Apocalypse World campaign. And so we played some Apocalypse World and we played some Monster Hearts. And that was kind of the intro.
That's
But yeah, I
awesome.
played Dread when I was I must have been in high school then. Yeah,
At
yeah,
the
it was
age
a
where
while ago.
maybe playing Dread was a questionable decision. I love
Yeah.
Dread. It's so
Me
good.
too. It's the only time I've ever played it, and I really want to play it again.
Like,
Yeah.
that's me. I played Dungeons and Dragons when I was like 9. We played a box set, somebody older brothers, and then I didn't play again until I played GURPS when I was in high school. And I still, like, I could
Wow.
count on less than 2 hands the number of times I played whatever the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons is. If I
Sure,
play, it's
sure.
usually like an older version. And yeah, it was GURPS for me all the way down for the first
Nice.
like 5 or 6 years. And so, um, no, that's like what is one of the things about, just like you said, and I love that you mentioned, like, well, we all from a young age, like, we're all playing, we're all doing these things. What was it about role playing games for you that was attractive? Like, what made you want to do that? Because it's something that, like, a lot of times we'll approach a friend and they'll be like, oh, yeah, maybe, or like, oh, is it something you were interested in doing, or was it something that somebody kind of coaxed you into?
The Dread game I got coaxed into, and I did not regret it at all. It was wonderful. But uh, after that, I think the thing that drew me to it and the easy sell for me for Dread was that I actually love acting. I didn't have a whole lot of opportunities for it after high school, but I did a lot of high school theater, surprise. And right, unlike every other RPG nerd I know, I was like super into that art form and expression. I love the way that a good script is written as a text. And I love the way that games that have a lot of layers and substantive emotional depth can lend themselves to incredible performances. And I kind of love that they're ephemeral, right? Like after a game is over, unless it's recorded, the only way you really preserve the memory of it is with other people who are at the table with you, basically through oral tradition. And
Mm,
that's kind of cool. And yeah, I find it really fascinating as a cultural form and an art form.
I love that. No, I want to come back to that ephemeral piece also too, probably a couple times. But let's start out. Let's talk about something that is a little bit less ephemeral. What are your favorite types of mushrooms? Because I know people want to know.
I was hoping we had time for. Oh, my book is so far away. Okay, I have so many favorite kind of mushrooms. My favorite just to find, like ignoring edibility or utility or whatever. This last winter was the first time I really started getting into mushroom hunting, and I've wanted to for so long. And the site that we went to is a mix of oak and redwood and just like lots of kind of biomes going in and out of each other. And in one part of this site, one of the foragers I went with was like, "Oh, check this out." And he just points, and there are all these little ghostly, translucent mushrooms, and they're related to the hedgehog mushroom, which is a toothed mushroom. So if you look on the underside of a toothed mushroom, they literally have little spiny little teeth. And hedgehog mushrooms are edible, they're delicious. And this one, I think it's the Pseudohydnum gelatinosum, which the common name for it is cat's tongue, is also edible. It just doesn't really have a lot of taste, but what it does have is a lot of bounce. Like you can you can boing it, like you can literally poke it and it'll like jiggle, and it's just so delightful because like the light filters through it and it looks like it glows. And it does hold its shape, so actually often people recommend preparing it by candying it. So that's
Oh,
what I did. I
interesting.
cooked it, yeah, I cooked it with simple syrup. And it wasn't bad. It was like a jelly candy.
That's
um
awesome.
yeah, yeah. And then, after that there's a mushroom, two types technically, but one is a little more potent, called candy caps, that only really grow in the Northern California coastline. Once you get to Southern California, they kind of disappear. Maybe you'll see them in the southernmost part of Oregon, but it's pretty rare. And so that feels really special to me. And the cool thing about candy caps is when you dry them, they have an aroma and flavor that's like really dark, warm
Mm.
maple syrup. And so you can use them in desserts, and a little goes a long way. You can infuse cream with them. You can make syrups. I know people who buy really nice bourbon and then they'll put like one candy cap in there and it'll like infuse the whole thing without making it really cloying. And it's just kind of cool. My One of my mushroom hunting mentors, I guess, like the person who I text to be like, "What is this?" is her favorite recipe is shortbread, where you actually take the candy caps, you dry them, and then you grind them up and put them in like a very buttery shortbread, and it's so oh my god, it's so good.
I love this. I
And then of
feel I
course
feel like California is one of the best places for hunting mushrooms. I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure that every region has like mushrooms that are unique and distinct to it.
you
But
do, yeah.
most of their people who I know who are really into gathering mushrooms are on the West Coast and usually in California. Um,
There are there are a lot of enthusiasts here for sure. California is one of those states that has such a blessing of geographic variety, which means we get a lot of different kinds of ecosystems across the state. And we have a really unique setup where often you'll have multiple kinds of biomes, which are types of ecosystems, all kind of overlapping each other in a relatively small square footage. So in a day, you could go from an oak savanna, which is like dry, arid, like little scattered oak trees across the foothills, to a redwood forest, to the dunes by the ocean, to, like it's amazing. And that kind of variety means you get some really cool stuff growing everywhere, including fungi. And Yeah, it's the only drawback is how much drier it's getting. And one of the things that I like to console myself with is the mycelium doesn't go away, but the fruiting bodies sometimes don't come up. So the roots, so to speak, will still be there. It's just I don't get to eat their friends. The drier it gets, you just have to go further and further north every year.
So anybody watching right now who's like, who maybe tuned in late, you're like, why are we on a mushroom seminar? We're talking to Jeeyon Shim, whose games and design I love. I said this in a tweet earlier, but I honestly believe it's true. I think Jeeyon is doing, along with a few other people, some of the most groundbreaking work in ttrpgs, and we're going to dive into that. But also, you are a naturalist, like you are an outdoor educator. That is a huge part of who you are and your background. So mushrooms were a good kind of entry point into that. But you are somebody who spends a lot of time in nature and sharing nature with other people. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I spent the last several years working as an outdoor educator with a company with a branch in the Bay and a branch in Portland. And it wasn't a job that I planned for. I needed pocket money and they needed summer camp instructors. I'm sure anyone who's ever run management for any summer camp will just feel that like right in their bones. And they had this whole department that taught naturalist skills, environmental stewardship principles, and wilderness survival principles to children through live action role playing. And so you dressed up, you would teach fire as a school of magic ritual, you would teach archery as like a druidic grounding practice, like whatever you wanted to make up, you would teach. And the thing is, I had none of those skills. I hadn't even gone camping when I got hired. And so there was a lot of crash course, like I was learning at the same time I was teaching. My second year, the company very generously offered to let me take a lot of their adult courses as professional
Mm.
development. And I just loved it. I had no idea that this was going to become such a huge underpinning for how I wanted to live my life. But it makes, looking back on my childhood and my adolescence, it makes a lot of sense because growing up, I often grew up not in rural areas, but sort of haphazardly developed areas. So, like, when the one time I lived in an actual honest to goodness suburb, we had empty lots all around that were just, southeastern seaboard deciduous forest woods. And
Mm.
so I would catch snakes in our house and have to take them out. And they're, God, the Jurassic Park sized bugs on the eastern seaboard. I forget sometimes, having moved out to California so long ago, like how big they were. And you were just in nature in a different way, I think, than when you live in an urban city environment. And so it makes sense to me because when I was a kid, I was running around in the woods or on the beach or whatever all the time. And it was, it was pre stranger danger laws. It was pre current legal and cultural system of supervision of children. And so I and a lot of kids whose parents worked most of the time, we were on our own, not in like a bad way. Like I loved it. Like I'm so
Yeah.
grateful that I got that experience because it taught us resilience. It taught us to kind of work out and solve our own interpersonal problems without appealing to authority. It also taught us that like how to explore just freely without a specific reason for it. And it really taught me how to play those formative years. I think both being in nature, that kind of play, and then coalescing into this professional like part of my life. Yeah, without all of those things, I wouldn't be making the kinds of games that I do, for sure.
Yeah. No, I grew up in a rural, but like the suburby type of rural where it's like everybody has 2 acre lots. Not everybody has, 10 to 15 acre working farms or,
Sure,
whatever.
yeah.
So, but it
Yeah.
was like half wooded, half whatever. And I recently, reviewed like the new edition of Into the Weird and Wild. And one of my favorite things about that, that book, which is like a system agnostic OSR game. I think it's still up on Kickstarter right now for anybody who wants to go check it
Oh,
out.
cool, cool.
Is it plays a lot on the natural wonder and awe that we experience as a young child in the woods, and the fear that we experience as it gets dark or as maybe we feel a little lost. And then cranks that up to 11 and actually just drops it into system agnostic like OSR type stuff. And it's very, very, very cool and very well done. But that was one of my huge reflections is like, you know, like we would gravitate towards the old well that no one knows why it's in the middle of these woods, or, you know, like the tree
Yeah.
that's fallen over and then other trees haven't, so it creates this natural kind of tinted space, and that just becomes a place of imaginative play for you as young children. And for me, I maintained that into teenage years, even as a bunch of my other friends weren't. And that was, I loved theater also too, because it gave me a place to go and experience a lot of those things. But also, I will say my wife and I have very different approaches to insects or animals in the house, because I grew up with it. Like, yeah, they're gonna come in, and
Yeah.
you gotta put them back out, either kindly or sometimes not as kindly as you might like, depending on
Hmm.
the animal.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it was totally a thing. And like for me, one of the things I mentioned yesterday that I really want to talk about, I've noticed more and more the background of people who have worked at camps, who also work in TTRPG areas, also do, whether that's content
Oh,
creation, whether that's whatever. There's
interesting.
seems to be more and more. And then my people always ask me about my game design process, and I always refer to it as pro social, because I was essentially designing like weekend LARP experiences for people to come out to,
Right.
and walk them through gamified like low ropes, high ropes, other things like that. And I see that type of stuff in your work so clearly, and the connected path and the keepsakes that you've been doing. But let's talk a little bit about that. Like, let's talk about
Yeah,
how
sure.
you feel like your experience as a nature education specialist through this camp stuff maybe influenced some of what your started to take place in your game design. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, often in my process, I tend to start with logistics, so we can start there as well. When I was working at this outdoor education company, I started as an instructor, but I got promoted to leadership, within a couple years. And a typical, there was no typical day exactly, but uh, due to a confluence of circumstances, both the scale of the company, we worked with literally thousands of children over the course of a summer. And it is not an exaggeration to say that I've personally taught thousands of children over those several years. And the Oregon branch is tens of thousands of children. And that involves buses, that involves permits, both for sites, for usage. It involves managing staff and children and parent expectations. It involves addressing things as they arise while also keeping a baseline of engagement and enthusiasm and fun for everybody, not just the kids, but also the staff. And at the same time, our meetings as leadership staff, we called them stand up safety, because we were literally standing up. God, I miss this meeting culture a lot. Actually, it was usually about 5 minutes, and we would
Camp
go
culture
around.
has meetings have to be well done because you don't have time otherwise.
It's
Like,
just, we literally had these meetings 10 minutes before the seasonal staff showed up, and the seasonal staff showed up 10 minutes before the doors opened. And so if it went longer than 5 minutes, it was because something was very wrong. And we just go around the circle as leadership and be like, where are we going? What are the three most common hazards? Is there anything we need to know? Is there, can we have a fire, or is there like a red flag warning? Just all the extremely necessary things. And then we'd go to our independent staff. And so for me, that was the teaching skills through role playing. And it would be a little more granular, like, here's where we're going, here are things you can do there. I know that you've planned your own activities. I had a very different style than my predecessor, where I really like to give a lot of leeway and independence to individual staffers, because their enthusiasms are not going to be my enthusiasms, and they know their groups. I don't. Like, I know those kids, but I'm not teaching them through the week. I'm managing the whole thing. And so all of that had to be conveyed again in about 5 minutes. And then the doors would open. And then if there was, a kid who was having a hard time saying goodbye to their parent, like whatever, if the bus was late, if There was a medical issue. Like all of that had to be managed in about 15 minutes, and then you were out the door. And with that background, it is, when I look at like making a game and producing a game, it feels um it feels like a very intuitive jump to start with what are the extremely necessary parts of this game, both in production, distribution, the design itself, the scaffolding, like whatever, and then go from there, including how, like, who am I pitching this to? What is really appealing about it? Is this something where I want to do it by myself or collaborate? What is the scalability of it?
Mm-hmm.
And often a lot of games in the very early development process for me could scale up or down. So then it's a commitment. Do I want to go big or do I want to keep it kind of small? And it doesn't have to be a definitive answer. Sometimes small games can become bigger ones, but like all of those questions, it's like muscle memory to start with the very practical bare bones underpinnings before I even really start thinking about the writing, aesthetic, tone, theory. Like mechanics to me kind of straddle the line between the design component and the logistics component. Um, but the reason I'm sharing this in such detail is because I think that not every designer has a background in team management, in leadership, in logistical programming, coordination, and design, and also in child management. And I think actually, of all of those things, child management really informs a lot of how I think about the player experience and how I think about what we even want from games. Because I think back not only to this job where you had to manage, you know, a positive play experience of lots and lots of kids at the same time, but I also think back to what we want very fundamentally as people, as children, and that's to make believe, it's to make stories together, it's to feel connected to each other, it's to make friends through these experiences, it's to be able to kind of peel back and have a more parallel play independent experience, but also come back in if you want to. It's essentially to feel belonging, right? And there are ways you can logistically plan for that
Mm-hmm.
and logistically design around that. But for me, it always starts with the bones of kind of what everything that could go wrong, and then you go from there.
I,
Which I don't feel pessimistic about it, but that's actually kind of how it works.
No,
So
I want to talk about that desire a little bit more. But I know a lot of people, when I kind of tossed out, hey, what questions you have? Logistics was a big part of that. Like
yeah,
you have, you did a field guide to memory, right? You have your most recent game, right, Shape of Shadows, that
yeah,
was up. You also had in the middle of that another incredibly successful Kickstarter that the Last Will and Testament of Gideon
live,
Blythe. Am I doing
yeah,
it right? Okay.
yeah. That was the Z Quest one
And
that I thought was going to be very small.
and
Yeah,
they've blown up. I remember like going to the, oh, I want one of these bigger packets this time, and I went there 30 minutes after you had launched, and they were all gone. Um,
yeah, that was nuts. Actually, I
but
really wasn't expecting that.
let's talk about some of those logistic things. Like you have mentioned, I think a couple places you want to do, like 4-ish like large Kickstarters a year is kind of one of your plans. Um,
Mhm.
as people desire more and more of this, well, actually, just describe a little bit about the type of those games, because I think the if I ask this question blankly, it's not going to make as much sense. The keepsake games, the ephemera that you're doing, all these other elements. Tell people a little bit about that, and maybe describe one of those games to people so they get a
Yeah,
little
for
bit of a
sure.
sense of that.
I would love that. Keepsake games and connected path games are two terms that I and my collaborator Jeeyon Core coined, and we didn't. To be very clear, we did not invent this type of game. We are not claiming that we made up a type of game at all. What we did was we created a vocabulary for it that suited our artistic mission statement. It's essentially an artist mission statement, which or statement of purpose for an artist, which is pretty common in other like more visually oriented creative fields. And uh, keepsake games are games that create an artifact, an actual physical, tangible artifact, as an intrinsic process of the game experience. And while there are a lot of games that have beautiful physical artifacts as part of them, they're not necessarily about the creation and the process of creation as the game play process. So that's the distinction of keepsake game. It's arts and crafts, and then connected path games are games where while players are often solo. Right now, I'm working on a couple that are have 2-player adaptations, but they're you're not going to sit down at a group table for a connected path game. The idea is that it's actually a very insular, individual experience, but there's theoretically lots and lots and lots of other people who are having that same experience with you. And so at the same time, you can share, you can be witnessed in those experiences. And so while your game is unique to you, no 2-player experiences in keepsake or connected path games have even a remote possibility of being the same, but you can walk together, right? You can explore those paths together. And the show and tell element is the core component of a connected path game. And you can do it passively too, just like in a classroom when you go around the circle and often there's that one kid who's too shy to do the show and tell, but they love seeing their friends show and tell. Like that's a key component of connected path games too. The idea is that there's actually a real creative community around you in this experience as you move through it. Yeah, I love making these games. They really captured my imagination as a designer.
Yeah, no, I've talked for years. Like people are like, "What's one of your favorite things that you think is underutilized in games?" And the inelegant term for it is artifaction, right? Like that's one of the educational terms that will get thrown out in like low ropes circles whenever you talk about the things you make at the end to process the experience. Like that's called artifaction. And I was like, I love it, and I include it in a lot of my games. But keepsake games, and it sounds way better and way more engaging.
That was all Shing. I was like connected paths. It's like kind of hard to explain. Shing was like keepsake games. It's so actually it was their husband, I think, who came up with it. Just randomly in the car. He was just like, "This is a term," and they were like, "This is perfect. How dare you?"
But it is like even in lower observation, people are like like other people would be like it's creative tactile processing because that sounds a little bit better, but it's no less whatever. Like there's all these other different ways, but it was taking a part of my favorite experiences of like, hey, we've done an experience and now we're all going to sit down and we're going to talk about what our experience was. And it took that part and it moved it right into that is the game. That is the thing we're doing. Like it is actually the experience itself as well as it. And so it's one of the reasons why I immediately gravitated towards that. And you also designed them, at least a few of them, as actual experiences. It wasn't like just here's the PDF, though you got the PDF. It was like, there are levels at which it's like, hey, you're going to get an email every day for the next 20 days. And you're going to go through this experience. You're not just going to sit down and like answer all the prompts and then be done. There's kind of this curated experience process. So where did that idea come from? And talk to me a little bit about what it was like to run that style of game.
Yeah, well, the first game I did that for was a game I co-wrote with a designer, Kevin Culp, called Wait For Me. And it was a great learning process. Is Wait For Me a connected path game? Not exactly. I think of it as sort of like a proto game leading up to Field Guide to Memory. Like I think of Field Guide to Memory kind of as like the start of this branch of my career. But Wait For Me was a wonderful design experience because it just showed me so much about what can be done with the form. And it was the first game where that daily email prompt was a core part of the game experience. And that in turn was based on a game called The Wishing Sigil by Banana Chan, which is a advent calendar horror game that she kickstarted, I want to say Christmas of 2019.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and the basic premise of Wait For Me is this was a learning experience as a designer too, right? You're playing kind of as yourself in this very meta way, and you're jumping through your own personal timeline uncontrollably, and you don't know where you're going to land. And so the daily email was actually a really core part of that because we didn't want to release the PDF until afterwards so that people didn't get spoiled for what day they would land on, what age they would be, what was happening in their lives. We also had to write the prompts so that they were specific enough that they felt personal, but universal enough that most people could relate to them and on some level. Which means I mostly made everything up, right? Like I remember someone forwarding me something where they were like, "It's so clear that this is autobiographical." I'm like, "It's absolutely not autobiographical in any way," but I get why someone would think that because they're so personally written. And that live experience really helped people feel like they were going through it together, because it turned out to be, for a lot of players, a fairly emotionally intense game. And uh, one of the design things that taught me was, if I'm going to design a game where the player is explicitly playing themselves, that is always going to feel more impactful than if they're playing a character. So that's why I feel like Field Guide was the the first foundational step, because that was very explicitly a character, but also is a very specific story, entirely fictional. There's literally cryptids in it. All the characters are clearly made up, but it's all resonant and stemming out of my and Xing's experience as being artists who are connected to nature, people who've occasionally run in academic circles, being people of color in, you know, white institutions, being part of Asian American diaspora. Like, all of that is uh, the kind of germination base of that game, even though the game is not necessarily explicitly about either of our individual experiences. And a lot of people directly related to it, even with these characters as they were playing. The live game component meant that they were able to share with us as designers and with each other as players, like, this felt this felt really close to home, or I remember going out on my first camping trip and all of these beautiful personal stories were being shared. And that's a really big part of connected path games. It's that campfire feeling, you know, when you're sitting around a fire at the end of a camping weekend, or like you've just worked an event. Like, that's one of the things I really miss about my old job. It was that part of your work day, was you'd sit
Mm-hmm.
around a fire, you'd maybe have a snack or something, or like be making tea together, and you just share whatever you wanted to. And it was so convivial and so warm. And seeing that dynamic crop up as a result of the way that we structured Field Guide to Memory was amazing. And so that's really what I'm trying to capture going forward in a lot of the work that I do, because I think it's a very human need to feel connected to other people that way, even at a distance, right? One of the remarkable things about this is no one's in the same room at the same time.
Right.
Um, and yet you feel like you're in communion with other people. It's kind of
Yeah,
cool.
there is like those experiences at camp, because camp creates this perfect sense of isolation. It creates its own little microcosm of culture and experience, and it
Yeah.
lets the rest of the world fall away in a really kind of amazing space.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but it's also very grounding, because you are typically out in the elements. Things are a little bit rougher. So like the concept of just good friends and relaxation around a campfire, and then like tea or good food at the end of a long, exhausting week, and the ability to talk about those things are pieces I feel like we miss in them in modernity a lot, but also just like we don't necessarily always know how to go back to those places, because not everybody has had an experience of that also too.
Yeah.
And I think your game's doing a phenomenal job of capturing that in a remote way, in a way that's like, hey, maybe you can't get away, but the ability to say, hey, we are creating our own little world that we're all going to walk through, and we're all going to be able to sit in, we're all going to be able to share together. I think you capture it just so perfectly and so incredibly well through the course of your play. And so, yeah, and I think like that kind of emotional core is something that very few people are building around. Like our games may be something that's exciting to us as designers, like a lot of the time, or we may love the theme, or it may be fun, but your games are always seeking, it seems like, to touch a really intentional emotional core that not as many other games or even designers will look to approach in what they're doing. There are plenty of people out there doing that work, but it's so consistent in all
Yeah.
of your work
Absolutely.
that I just it's amazing to kind of watch unfold every single time you you make one. But you also
Thank
are
you.
very hands on, like with these games. Like you're curating the experience.
Yeah.
You're gathering the ephemera. You are painting the the blood trees. I don't know what they were for
Oh
what they,
yeah.
and
No.
sprinkling salt from your hand whittled pineapple spoon
Yeah. Yeah.
over them.
I am
Um,
very hands on. You're right. I'm in a friend once gave me an amazing multifaceted compliment where we were talking about some interpersonal stuff, and she was like, the thing is, I know you know what the good advice is, and I'm going to give it to you, but you're also still going to do the thing anyway, because you have to learn by doing. You're an experiential learner. And I was like, you're you're right. I always have to get my hands in there
Yeah.
in order for something to sink in. And I think that a lot of people are like that actually. Again, it's a fundamental way of how we learn, and some people adapt to less tangible learning methods as they get older. But I have always preferred things where I can literally do things with my hands, or be moving somewhere, right? Like actually physically embody the learning process in some way. It's why I really like uh, exercise, actually, working out and being outdoors, and even if it's not for any purpose, just kind of like gardening really saved me this last year, because so much of it is just puttering,
Mm-hmm.
right? You look at your garden, and there's always something where you're like, ah, shit, and you have to like take care of something, but it's all very physically embodied. And I think that there are ways, again, to foster that connection to yourself as well in design, in experience design, game design, whatever. Um, and that it's important to do. Gaming is also physical. You're still sitting at a table. You're still using your body. You're using your voice. You're using everything, and if you sit for too long, it sucks. You know, like if you're not watching your posture, it sucks. If you don't drink enough water over the experience, it can actually really color the emotional impact of what you're playing, like all of it. Like you have to pay attention to your corpus,
Mm-hmm.
even as everything is coming out of your creative expression. You know, in a weird way, it feels like a microcosm of something that I heard that I immediately agreed with and have not been able to stop thinking about. I can't remember where I heard or read this, but I'll try to find it. Someone said that one of the worst things to happen to environmentalism and environmental justice was the phrase the natural world,
Mm.
because the whole world is the
Is the
natural
natural
world.
world.
Right. We're in a material world. We embody a tangible, corporeal world. Everything is the natural world. And even in incredibly urban, landlocked, greenless spaces, you still have gulls, squirrels, like there's weeds growing through the sidewalk. There's always the natural world, because that's the world we live in. But this idea of creating with the power of language and words this phrase that kind of compartmentalized it. It created this idea of what the natural world is, which is, by the way, extremely in the US based in like white settler colonialism. And by necessity of that definition, like the displacement and genocide of indigenous communities.
Right.
Because when we think of a wilderness, we think of a very specific kind of landscape, but that landscape is fabricated. If
Mm-hmm.
you look at primary resources of European settlers, from Britain and also Spain, a lot of them say this like very common phrases like it looks like a garden. These people are just walking through and picking food, and there's a abundance of animals, as if that wasn't deliberately cultivated generation after generation after generation, and
Right.
then it was completely changed, and now that's the world we live in, right? We
Right.
can't go back to that original world, but we can live in tandem cooperatively with the world that we're in. And in the same way, when we game, if we don't pay attention to our body, it fucks up our game experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like you have to think about these things holistically and in constant active practice. And it's very funny to think about almost this like little matryoshka, right? Well, that's not the right thing. It honestly, it really is like an ecosystem, right? Like every little thing has strings connected to every other little thing, and you throw one out of balance, the whole thing goes out of balance in some way or another. You might not know it for a long time, but you know, I know people who thought they didn't like D&D. I actually, I'll just speak for myself. I thought I didn't like D&D because, you know, I played a few games. You had to sit at a table. It was so long. A combat turn took like an hour, and I didn't understand why you couldn't just punch somebody. But then I started playing through the pandemic with some high school friends, and it wasn't about D&D. It was about keeping in touch with each other because we missed each other. And I could get up. I could fidget. I could go for water. We were on Zoom. It didn't
Right.
fucking matter. Like, yeah, sometimes I turned my camera off just because I was exhausted by looking at my own face. And it just completely changed the experience. And it turns out, oh, it wasn't that I don't like D&D. It was that I don't like sitting still completely for like 4 or 5 hours. And for whatever reason, I felt like I had to with these other groups.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you you can form entire impressions of what you like or don't like, and maybe it's actually that you're just not paying attention to your body.
It's one of the things I try to reinforce with players, but I also try to be very transparent about on stream. Like, everyone who comes on this stream is a person. And if we're about to sit down and play a game and they haven't had dinner yet, that's going to be a problem for everyone at the
Mm-hmm.
table. But I actually care about them. Where if even if it wasn't a problem for the rest of them, I just want them to go eat something. And even if that means muting their mic and sitting back or turning off their camera or just eating on screen because it's a normal human behavior, like
Yeah.
that's all fine. It's not actually a sign of professionalism. It's a sign that we're people. And this isn't
Yeah.
about a performance. It's about people sitting around a virtual space playing a game.
Yeah.
Like, people talk about design aesthetic from time to time, and I do think, like, it's one of the reasons I'm so attracted to your design work. I tend to start with, what is the experience like. I'll come up with the theme or the basic conceit of the game, but my first real question I'm asking is, what is the experience I want people to have playing this game at the table? Because if a game is meant to be
Yeah.
played sitting at a table, all those things matter. So every choice I'm going to make, thematically, mechanically, like, I want to think about the physical incarnation of that thing, which we tend to separate from, right, in very weird ways. How those all work. Which I love the reflection on environmentalism, because even if none of those animals exist, like, you do, and you are part of nature, right? Like,
Yeah,
you are
we're
you
all
are not you are not separate from it, and the experience of the ecosystem of play is not just separate from the players. And as designers, I think lots of
exactly.
times
Yeah.
that's our mindset. We're focused on the book we're going to produce. And I'm a collector of books. Like, I buy crap all the time. I will never play because I love the idea of the artifact of that book existing in my hands. But at
Yeah.
the end of the day, I'm mostly enthralled with what comes out of those pages,
Right.
at the table
Right.
as the experience. And your
Yeah.
your games,
And I mean, I think those physical books can also be embodied, right? I'm actually working on several games for, oh my God, I really hope I don't jinx myself. Like, knock on wood, cross my fingers. I am going to try doing some Kickstarters with print runs for the first time. And I'm so nervous because it's like my weak spot logistically. I just don't understand it at all. But I have a lot of friends who've been through it, who are down to help me. Again, I'm a hands-on learner, so I'm only going to learn how to do it by doing it.
right.
And I want to design books that, whether by a solo player or by a group of people, can literally be like at the center of the table, and you have to touch it, you have to look through it. There's a mechanic that I've been developing since last fall. I talked about this a little bit on Twitter, I think yesterday, for the Shape of Shadows, which is an image search mechanic where
Yeah.
I was doing some very pretentious bad idea things with like randomization tables where,
Uh-huh.
like, you look outside and depending on the weather, that's the page you flip to and things like that. And it's like, well, that could really throw people's experiences off depending on where they live and stuff like that. And then I started thinking about subconscious associations and the kinds of books that I really liked as a kid, which were like I Spy, Where's Waldo, things where you had to like really engage with a static photo or picture. And often it was illustrations, it was art, and so you would notice things. Like, a lot of what I taught in my outdoor education practice was just how to notice things, how to pay attention. And when you're looking through an image that way, and especially when it's like kind of big, you can see the texture of the brush strokes, you can see where shadow falls. And so there's going to be, in the Shape of Shadows, things like, oh my gosh, how do I talk about this without giving it away too much?
I can let me
There-
I looked at the image you're
yeah.
talking about, so let me go find it real quick. I'll just pop it up on the screen next to
Yeah,
us,
yeah, yeah.
because
And there's
that's a
things
good
like,
way.
what is the first like what is the first thing you notice or the last thing you notice? Like, those are important mechanically as well as narratively. And let me tell you, from a writing and design perspective, it's very challenging to write it in a way where, like, nonetheless you still reach the same climax, like all these different people with these different experiences. But like, I love the idea that a solo player with their subjective subconscious experience could be like, I see a dog or I see a tree, like, immediately, and that has a specific mechanical significance. um and I love the idea that that could translate into a group game too, where every single person brings a different thing that they notice to that particular role or whatever you want to call it, and then that actually drives their story. Because that's what I would do during sit spots. That's what I would do when I was still an instructor, was we would go out to a landscape and I'd be like take your fingers and go like this and then stop at the very edges of your vision, and it was often like almost a panorama, like almost 360. And then I would have all my kids say like the first thing they noticed, and then from that we would actually make a story together.
Yeah.
And that exercise as a creative exercise was like one of my favorite things to do. And it's because those kids went away feeling like they could see anything, and I love that feeling, and I think that you can capture it in an indoor kind of way. And I
Yeah.
think that you want to break through that barrier of thinking of the natural world as a separate thing. That means you have to bring it inside with you too.
That's cool.
So
So
I'm really excited about this. Let's see. We'll
I've
see
got
how
I've
it
got the
works.
image up next to us. So it's from December 1st of last year. You said same
Oh
flavor
yeah.
without spoiling. It's without spoiling for others. You said a stopwatch and look for the small red snake without a human eye. How long does it take you to find it?
Yeah, that was one of the rejected images actually, because it brought up some issues in terms of value versus saturation. For so like for people who are colorblind, they might have a really hard time
Right.
distinguishing just the borders of it. So, but yeah, that's the thread. We can link to it later if people are interested. Yeah, I'm really excited about it because it feels like a new type of design, element that I want to play with in a kind of long term way, because I love imagery and I love visuals.
Yeah.
I think just using our senses in different ways to notice things is very powerful.
One of my favorite just intro pieces that I'll do with people, especially if I have, because there are a number of times I've had like 10-minute workshops, and you're like, what can you workshop in 10 minutes? As far
Mm.
as like you know uh, pro social stuff, and so it was like, hey, I want everybody to try to sit down as close to a minute as you possibly can without looking at your clock,
Ooh,
without
I
looking at
like
anything else,
that.
right? Just give them a time and say try that, and you just do it, right? And you say no talking, no anything else, like you can do whatever you want
Oh
internally,
my god. For
but
me,
like
it's always it's about 15 seconds in that people are like, "Oh my god, a minute is very
it
long."
is, right? and
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
even processing, like just stopping and saying, let's process what was everybody's experience like for extroverts in the room, it was the worst. For introverts in the room, the best part of their day, right? But you talk about it a little bit, and then we'd read some sort of typically grounding text, right? That's designed to take their
Right.
minds away, focus on
Yeah.
some to a certain degree the illusion of time, whatever, and like now let's try again and see how close you do. And
Mhm.
you never tell people, it doesn't matter. Like I don't tell people, like I tell people, like the first person who sat down and the last person who sat down, I don't tell them who got the closest, right? Like I just say,
Yeah, yeah.
here's where we were at in that process, which is a great group mechanic. Like just tossing out to your table group, this is all going to happen in a minute. Your character acts when they think they think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Tell me when that is, and then we'll come back and talk about what they specifically did, and we'll talk about how successful they were based on when they acted and how those things fell into place. You can do that kind of stuff at a table and create a different type of
Yeah,
experience.
absolutely. Well,
But
I think that also speaks to like the human experience of every individual person has their own subjective experience, their own subjective reality, but you weave it together into a tapestry of a shared experience. It doesn't mean any one person is right. It
right,
just means
yeah,
that we are moving through different realities simultaneously all the time. And it's just one of those things where if you think about it too hard, you know, you kind of short circuit. So you don't really think about it, you just do it.
right.
Um, there is a sorry, I looked away from the screen for a second because this conversation reminded me of I just put up on my Patreon my first remote adaptation of a two-player game that I
Is
wrote in
this Witch's
2019.
Cottage?
The Witch's Cottage, yeah. And I really love this game. I don't think it's going to be like a cash cow game, but it's one of my personal favorites. And I've been wrestling. The way I wrote it was as a LARP. You played it in person. There was a lot of negotiated physical touch on the shoulders, the hands, the wrists, things like that. And you used tangible objects. I think the first iteration was bowls of water and string, and then the later iterations were with stones that you like stacked or put in your hands or whatever. And then most people started playing remotely, and I've been wrestling with this, with how to adapt it remotely for a year on and off, and I finally got it. And I wanted to, when you were talking about your exercise, asking people to sit for a minute, and like the thing you like to ask any group of people, there's something in the player calibration section that I wrote that is literally lifted from a thing that I teach with a lot. Where is it? So there's a section after like the check-in of just like, how are you, like catching up,
Are
because
you okay if I share this on screen?
oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
I mean, I did a quick scan through. I just want, as we're talking about it, I'll put it up
Yeah,
along with it.
yeah. Is there, wait, are you on my Patreon or?
I am on your Patreon.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, if you go to the player calibration
Oh, no, I'm
section.
there already. It's up.
Yeah, great. If you look under anchoring, all of that is opening each person, wherever they are long distance, opens their window, and then they have to kind of tell each other what they see, what they hear, what they smell. And it's the hearing one that I would actually use in almost all my programming, which was like, listen really carefully, listen for the smallest thing. What do you think it is? And what sound does it have? And when kids answer this question, it's like the best fucking thing. They like blew my mind every single time. They'd be like, I can hear grass right over there, and I can hear it because I think there's a bug on it, and I think there's a bug on it because I'm worried about it. The way that they would like kind of bring it back, they'd be like, I can hear like a bird, and I didn't think I was going to hear it so far. And then we would start there and be like, okay, now do you think you can like stretch your ears and hear things just 10 feet away from that? How about 10 feet away from that? And then we would keep going and going until they felt like they had superpowers, because they
Right.
kind of are actually.
Right.
But as a grounding exercise, I love that because we live in very noisy spaces, most of us. Whether you're rural or urban, there's always something to hear. There's always something to see. There's always something to smell. And I think that being able to start a game just by noticing your own sensory processes will instinctively attune you to kind of what you need. And also in a two-player game, it's so intimate, and you are there to care for your co-player. Your co-player is there to care for you, but also you both have to be practicing self-awareness. It's a very um, little hermetic chamber that you're creating between the two of you. And so it's nice to be like, oh, I am sitting somewhere where it's very comfortable and warm with the window open, but my co-player is in Australia. It's winter there. And so like maybe we're going to have to stop if they need a cup of tea or something like that. Just kind of like putting it on your radar what you both might need. Yeah.
And
But also
I love coming from the experience of outdoor play. Like I love rituals for play. Also coming from a
yeah.
deeply religious background, I love rituals for play. The I mean, and we oftentimes do this with closing rituals because we connect them to advancement or XP or resolution in some way, shape, or form. And lots of toolkits have brought this out, but we oftentimes don't give attention to that beginning of play process, which,
Mhm.
and outdoor stuff might just be as simple as we're going to stretch and I'm going to ask a question as we go around and
Yeah.
stretch because we're getting ready
Also
to do
the
something
invisible
physical.
stuff, like we're not going to set up this game in glaring sunlight in this open
Right.
field.
Right.
Like, yeah,
And
but that
so,
stuff is part of the design process too. And participants don't see it, but coordinators do,
yeah.
right? Like that. And like if you're making an analogy in game design, like game designers are somewhere between participants and
Mhm.
coordinators. And so you kind of have to think the way both
You've got
both
to be giving the coordinators the tools in order to help the players fully engage
yeah,
a lot of the time. And sometimes
yeah,
people are straddling both of those things. And
absolutely.
like I gave friend of the show Jeremy Gage from the Draw Your Dice podcast a book recommendation a little while ago on one of my favorite kind of secret creative process books, and it's something I use for
Hmm.
meetings and for large gatherings. I've taken ideas in there and blown them up into huge scale events at conferences and other stuff like
Oh,
that.
cool.
And I'm not going to tell anybody what it is. Come back next week to find out. I don't know.
Yes, clever.
And
Good.
it's but his immediate response was like, "Oh man, this is all such great GMing advice." And I was like, "Well, crap. Actually, a lot of this time when I write GM procedures, I'm pulling stuff from this. Like I'm giving people here's a
Hmm.
tool to use to
Yeah,
start to draw your players in a little bit more." And get them to consider these things. And so, like for one of our games, everybody at the beginning is going to create a singular motif, something that's character level that your character sees and feels and perceives about the world, and that's
yeah,
going to matter mechanically in the game. Whatever you happen to say is going to be important, and it can be
yeah,
as goofy
yeah.
or as serious as you want, but it's about to matter. And if you don't
I
know,
love
just answer this question, and we'll pull something out of there as a group together and name that thing, like the front loading process of it. So
absolutely.
you know
Yeah, yeah.
No,
I
like
think front loading, if it's done deliberately, it can be really powerful. So like also in the Witch's Cottage, a lot of the game time is actually creating the context for your
yeah,
interaction as two characters, and the gameplay time is not longer than that. It's often shorter, but that's because you enrich that play time with it if you're doing it on purpose,
right.
right? You don't
Yeah.
feel impatient. It's not rushed. Speaking of rushed, actually, I
I would
feel
say
like
I know we've got it.
yeah.
You've got probably got a timeout. We're 5 minutes over. So,
Okay.
but yeah, with that said, yeah, the difference is like front loading is a good thing. Railroading tends to be a bad thing, and those are like
Right,
just the
right.
two things to understand. Like when you're giving people context, what do they need to know? Like how are you
Mhm.
giving them ownership of the space versus here's what we're going to do, and we have to do this. Where there's no conversation.
Right, right, right. Yeah, absolutely.
So final shout out. Just tell people again where they can find your stuff if they're interested in learning more.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you're interested in the games themselves, my Patreon is the best place because literally everything I make goes there, including PDFs of my Kickstarter stuff. If you're interested in specific titles, then I would check out my itch.io store.
Awesome.
Although it won't be complete. There's a lot of Patreon exclusive stuff that I make.
And I've talked about it a couple times. I did just become a patron yesterday, which I'm super excited about because I do
Oh,
love
yay.
supporting your
Oh,
work.
thank you. Wow. Thank you
Um,
so much.
and so, well, I've said it like 2 or 3 times, and like anytime you post something, I'm like, why am I still not a patron for you? So I just solved that problem yesterday because I was going to load up links, and I was like, I'm here. But
For sure.
please, yeah, everybody should please go check it out. I absolutely think people should be supporting this type of work. If you had all enjoyed this conversation, then please go check out everything that Jeeyon is up to. Do you have a project coming up people should be excited about? I know you're just finishing one, so that's a
Uh,
loaded question, but
Yeah, I mean, the PDF for Gideon Blythe is going up very soon. The Shape of Shadows, its live run is roughly projected for July, late July, August. And the reason it's not set in stone is because I'm actually trying to go by creative contributor schedule so they don't get stressed out. There is one more Kickstarter game that I'm doing this year called Animal Bride, which I'm very, very excited about. And that will probably be in mid to late fall.
awesome. Well,
Yeah.
it's been an absolute blast to talk to you. By the way, everybody, if you want to support the channel, we believe that content or that game designers should be able to support it for free. You can help us maintain that and pay our staff better because we pay them well already. But it helps us keep the channel going if you go support us at coffee.com/+1 EXP. We'll have other stuff going up there soon. We just started doing it about a month ago. But until next time, this has been Prestige Class with Jeeyon Shim, and class is dismissed.
This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right.